Okay, I think that's good now. Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Kate, and today I wanted to do a tier list. I'm doing this live just so that I don't have to edit it. I tried to put together a tier list a couple weeks ago, and it was just too daunting for me. So I wanted to do this live and kind of go through all of the books that I read in 2022. I ended up, I think on the thumbnail, I have 94 books. It's actually 89 because I had a number of books that I read more than once this year. So the number's slightly off, but we'll just see how it goes. And I am not going to be giving any synopsis for these. Well, maybe a short one, just because I don't want to have this take an hour and a half. So you'll see me talk about them a little bit, but mostly this is a tier list of how much I enjoyed the book rather than like its objective merit, just because I don't think that in reviews you can really do that. So that's what I'll be doing. Hello. Okay, so I'm going to start off. I have these in, let me share my screen actually. Okay. So I have these in the order that I read them. The first one that I'm going to take a look at or talk about is The Alchemy of Masks and Mirrors. And, I guess this isn't in the order that I read them. But anyway, alphabetical order. This is by Curtis Craddock. It is a steampunk fantasy book. I definitely enjoyed it. I wouldn't call it a new favorite, but it's a fun sort of quasi-historical fantasy if you enjoy those sorts of things. Then we have, I read the entire Murderbot series in 2022. So this is the first book in that series. It is an all-time fave for me. I adore Murderbot as a sort of anxious, a very snarky sort of cyborg that is just trying to basically watch its TV shows, but it keeps getting dragged into stuff. So that one is a great time. Then we have A Marvelous Light by Freya Marsk, and this one I really ended up liking. It's a fantasy romance. It's kind of Gaslamp. It is very spicy, so if you don't like spicy gay romance, it may not be your thing, but I really, really enjoyed the relationship. There's a sort of, it's like a Grump and Sunshine with a sort of himbo athletic character and a more reclusive scholarly character, and they ended up getting involved in stuff. It's super fun. I don't know if I could call it an all-time fave. I would probably put it above Alchemy. But I don't know if we'll see. I'll circle back later and see if I want to rearrange these. Then we have Apothecary Diaries. I read both. This is a manga that is sort of historical with an apothecary who gets kidnapped and then basically sold into servitude at the palace and ends up solving some mysteries because she's such a great apothecary. I think I'd probably put both of them and enjoyed it. I didn't like the second volume as much as I liked the first one, but it's a fun, just good time manga. Then this is the second, Artificial Condition is the second Murderbot. I think I would put it in almost there. It's not quite a new favorite. I didn't like it as much as the first one, but it's still really good. And it introduces a character I really like. So that one's fun. Hello. And feel free to comment on any of these if you have read any of them. I'm just going to be sort of sorting through them. So I'll try and keep up with comments on it. But this is my reading for 2022, if you're not aware. Next, we have Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. Definitely an all-time fave. I would probably put it above All Systems Red, just because it's such an emotional roller coaster that follows A kid growing up who's like the bastard son of a prince ends up getting trained as an assassin, but it's not the focus. The focus is on him growing up and the relationships in his life. So it's pretty slow-paced, character-driven, but it's a lot of fun. Well, I guess fun's maybe not the right word. The prose is beautiful. Then we have A Taste of Golden Iron by Alexandra Rowland. This is, it's billed as sort of a fantasy with fantasy romance that is similar to Goblin Emperor. It is very, very slow burn, but I really liked it. I would probably put it again in almost there. I would definitely put it above Artificial Condition. I really liked the slow character growth for a prince who has to prove himself to his sister and ends up having to work with a bodyguard who doesn't really like him at the beginning. And you get to see them sort of grow from being people who have to work together to being friends, to being more than friends. So it's just really fun to see that growth for them. Then we have Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. I picked this up originally in 2021, and I ended up DNFing it because I had a hard time. There's a POV in here that's more political fantasy inspired, and it's slow. The character is very naive, which is something I always struggle with. And I ended up picking that up for a book club this year, which is a shout out to the book checkout book club that I do with a couple friends. So we did this one in December. It was really fun to discuss with everybody, and I ended up liking it a lot more the second time around. I still didn't like that same POV quite as much, but I definitely really enjoyed it. Where would I put it though? I'd probably put it in, is it almost there? Yeah, I think it is, just because it's such an interesting world. It's really based on sort of Mesoamerican cultures. It's fantasy, but it's not Western, which is always really nice to see. So that's definitely one that I liked quite a bit. Then we have Black Tongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman. I love this book. I can't put it above Assassin's Apprentice, but it's definitely an all-time fave. You follow a thief who ends up getting dragged along on a quest. I read the audiobook for that one, and Christopher Buehlman, the author, narrates it, and he does a spectacular job. There's songs that they have someone come in and sing on it. It's just great production for it. So definitely recommend that, especially if you like some humor. It's not going to work for everybody, but I loved it. Then we have The Book Eaters by Sun Yi Dean. This one, unfortunately, did not work super well for me. It's definitely a book that a lot of people are loving. It's sort of an urban fantasy focusing on a reclusive society that survives by eating books instead of eating food. But it focuses a lot on misogyny and oppression in a way that I'm just kind of over as a concept. So it just wasn't my cup of tea, and I don't like strong thematic elements. But I think if you like that, it's well worth picking up. Yeah, that, I assume you're talking about the Buehlman audiobook. It's spectacular. The main character is a little bit on the crass side, so if you don't like that, it may not work as well, but I thought it was fantastic. So if you end up picking it up, definitely let me know what you think of it. Clockwork Boys, and I'm gonna drag Wonder Engine into this too. So this is a steampunk fantasy by T. Kingfisher that I absolutely adored. So Clockwork Boys is basically the first half of it, and this is sort of the proper start to her World of the White Rat series, which has both fantasy and fantasy romance in it. In fact, a lot of her fantasy books have some element of romance, but it's usually not the focus. But Clockwork Boys has like a ragtag crew that has to work together. They're almost all criminals that have been roped in to going on what's basically like a suicide mission. I tend to describe it as like a steampunk suicide squad, but the first Clockwork Boys covers the first half where they're journeying to this other nation that is sending out a bunch of clockwork soldiers that are kind of decimating everybody. And their goal is to try and stop these clockwork soldiers or eliminate them. But they don't always, there's no guarantee of them being able to do that. The Wonder Engine picks up halfway through. I don't like it as much. I really don't like certain elements of a romance that develops in here. And it became kind of predictable. Like I think I'm actually going to put it down here in front of Apothecary Diaries. It's just the fun elements are less present, and I could predict all of the beats that happened, and that just kind of leads to a less fun experience for me. Hey Kristen. This is my first live show and I was nervous about it, so I didn't do a lot of advertising for it, but maybe I should have. Okay, so Dark Queens by Shelley Puhak. This is a nonfiction. I would definitely describe it as narrative nonfiction. I'm not sure how many people who watch my channel read a lot of nonfiction, but since I mostly talk about fantasy. Narrative nonfiction is basically less dry. It's more focused on telling a story, but it's still incorporating a lot of like historical facts. And I typically don't love that. I got this via NetGalley originally and ended up waiting until I had the physical book just because there's a lot of cool pictures and graphics in there that I wanted to have while I read it. And I am glad I did that. I don't regret buying it. But Puhak is a poet originally, and she does some stuff in The Dark Queens, which is focused on two queens from the Merovingian time period. It's sort of post-Rome, but before you really get very far in the medieval period. It has strong vibes of Game of Thrones because the two queens in question do some pretty messed up things in support of their goals for them and their families. But I don't love Puhak tends to get really down on historians because she thinks they haven't represented these women very well, which as a history major, I didn't necessarily appreciate a lot. She also kind of puts herself in their shoes in a way that I don't like, because the way that a modern person thinks is not the same as the way someone from that time period would think. So again, I'm going on too long about that, but it was just okay for me. I don't love that style that much. So Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie is a reread. I love this book. It's a Poirot mystery, if anyone's not familiar with those. It's one of the better ones, I think. I've kind of skipped around with Poirot, so I haven't read them completely in order, but I like the way that it dwells on responsibility in a relationship. It's very interesting. I don't love the movie as much, the newest movie, which was the driving factor in reading this. But it's not the worst either. Okay. Jin Falls in Love is an anthology, and I would probably put and Didn't Hate It. I would put it above Book Eaters. It's a bunch of short stories that are all based on Jin. And some of the short stories are spectacular, like 2 or 3 I loved. And then most of them are just okay. they're not amazing. So, and there's one I outright disliked. So if you like Jin, I would recommend picking it up just to see if the short stories work for you, because there's some clever ideas in there. But I wouldn't call it an all-time fave for sure. Dolores Claiborne by Stephen King is really good. I'd probably put it in almost there. It is a Stephen King story that's even more character-driven than usual, wherein like the main character, Dolores Claiborne, has been accused of murder, and she's basically defending herself by saying, I didn't kill the person I've been accused of, but I did commit another crime, which I'll tell you about if you listen to my story, basically. It's super voicey. The audiobook is the way to go for sure, because there's a really strong main accent for the main character, and she's telling the whole story from her perspective with a lot of commentary to the police that are interviewing her. It's very entertaining, and they do a couple sound effects in it that are super fun. So I would definitely recommend picking that up if you are more character driven and if you want a main character who's fairly sassy but delves into some darker things. It's not as scary as other Stephen King books, but it's fun. I'm actually going to talk about Hunt the Stars before I talk about Eclipse the Moon. So Hunt the Stars is the first book in the Starlight Shadow sci-fi romance series by Jesse Mihalik. I would definitely put enjoyed this probably between Apothecary Diaries. So I think I liked this a little bit better. The issue with Hunt the Stars is it's very much like if you're looking for a sci-fi that has Firefly vibes, that's the one. But it also has a very strong romantic element, and it's written in first person. So it just kind of depends on your patience with that. You kind of have to like romance to like it, but the focus is more on this sort of enemies to lovers, where you have a ship captain who's having to help out an alien that she was basically just at war with not that long ago. And sort of a romance develops, but I don't think the romantic elements are in like 75%. So it takes a while to develop. And then this year I read Eclipse the Moon, and this one I didn't like as much. I'm not going to get super into it because I am trying to avoid talking too much about HarperCollins, which I didn't look up most of these before I picked this up, but there's the strike going on if you're not aware of that. I just didn't like it as much. So do I even... I'll figure that out later. It's somewhere in here. Either enjoyed it or didn't hate it. I can't decide. I also read the Singing Hills cycle. So the first one is Empress of Salt and Fortune. This is by Niveau. I would probably put this here. So this is a series of novellas. And it's very intriguing. The main character is Chi, who's a cleric who goes around collecting stories. Chi is non-binary. And in this first one, Chi is interviewing a maid who was connected to an empress who has since, I believe, passed away. But they're finally able to start telling stories about her. And it's very interesting. It's an interesting method of storytelling because each section is prefaced by an artifact or a piece of clothing that this empress wore, which then leads to that part of the story. So it's very interesting. I wouldn't call it an all-time favorite necessarily, which is funny because I think I gave it 5 stars, but I liked it. Exit Strategy is book number 4 in the Murderbot Diaries, and I liked this quite a bit. Probably not more than A Taste of Golden Iron, but Murderbot gets back to dealing with some of the same humans that it was with in the first novella. I really liked the dynamic with Murderbot and those humans a lot more than I liked it in Artificial Condition. And it's a fun return for Murderbot. Oh, next one is Fast Red Road by Stephen Graham Jones. This one's a hard one to rate. I'd probably put it didn't hate it. This is not for me. I wouldn't put it as far as should have DNF'd because I think Graham Jones's writing is really good. It's just very literary fiction and trippy literary fiction at that, where you're following a young Indigenous man who goes home for his father's funeral, but there's like all these crazy dynamics and sort of dream sequences. It's just, I feel like you need 4 readings to understand what the heck is happening in that book. So I would put that definitely and didn't hate it. I think if I were more of a literary fiction reader, it would probably be somewhere up here. I think it is also one of SGJ's first published books. So I think you sort of see his growth from there to something like The Only Good Indians, which I loved, but didn't read this year. I am going to talk about, I hate that this kind of shuffles these into alphabetical order. So Green Rider, I read first. This is by Kristen Britton. I'd probably put it in enjoyed it. Maybe here. This is young adult 90s horse girl fantasy, which reminded me a lot of Arrows of the Queen by Mercedes Lackey. And a young girl kind of gets roped into being a messenger for the king, which involves all kinds of magic and this sort of dark force that is starting to come about in the kingdom. And I didn't love the first half, but the second half kicked things up for me. So it made me kind of curious to continue. And then I did continue with First Writer's Call, which I liked substantially more. I'd probably put that there. I have not continued since with the series. I think you can definitely tell it's 90s fantasy, but it is still fun. And I ended up really liking how First Writer's Call kind of expands on the world, and you get to see more of the magic and learn more about these king's messengers, known as riders. So it's good. I think I will continue with the series at some point, but it's not a huge priority for me. Then another Stephen Graham Jones. This is actually a book he wrote with Paul Tremblay, if you're familiar with him. Floating Boy and the Girl Who Couldn't Fly. It's sort of sci-fi, I guess. I probably would have DNF'd this if, where would I put this? Yeah, somewhere in there. It's definitely young adult. The main character's sort of on the obnoxious side, but basically a whole bunch of people in the town start floating and she doesn't. And so she's trying to figure out what's happening, ends up meeting this boy who does float, and they sort of trying to figure out what's going on. I kind of wish I hadn't got an answer on what was happening because it was very difficult for me to believe. So I don't think it's terrible, but I also don't love it. We have Fugitive Telemetry. This is technically the most recent Murderbot. I'd probably put it here. Definitely a fave. I love Murderbot as detective. Like, that was just so fun. This takes place technically prior. It's the 6th book in publication order, the 5th in terms of like timeline. And it's such a good time. I absolutely loved it. I can see why it was disappointing for people who picked it up after Network Effect, because Network Effect leaves off on a very specific point. And it would be weird to circle back to a point before that if you were expecting it to expand on it. So I definitely see why people didn't love it as much. But because I read it before Network Effect, it didn't ruin that for me. Then we have Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. This is a contemporary romance, which I almost never read. But I ended up really enjoying it. I would probably put it above Dark Queens for sure. Maybe in here. It was just a good time. I don't read contemporary romance much. Like I said, I just kind of need the speculative elements or historical elements in my mysteries and romance. So that's why I didn't like it as much. We all know where this is headed. This is going straight to the top. Yeah, I had a friend who highly recommended it to me. Otherwise I might not have picked it up. I love historical romance and read a ton of the Regency romances in the past. I don't read them as much these days, but I really liked it. So, did you read that one, Kristen? I'm curious to hear. But yeah, Gideon is. I'm a Locked Tomb fangirl. I will fully admit that. You'll see several Locked Tomb books show up in here. This, I don't think it does it a service to call it necromancers in space, lesbian necromancers in space, because the romantic element is such like a subplot of it. It's really more the puzzle and the immense amount of snark that is the appeal for Gideon. It's also, I feel like, intentionally confusing. There's a lot of stuff that happens in Gideon that you don't really start to understand until several books down the line, which makes it a fun one to reread, but I can see making it a little difficult to watch otherwise. Then we have Girl. Oh, wait, let me just undo this first. Yeah. Oh, cool. I'm glad to hear that that you love the series and that the second one is really good. I'll definitely have to check that out. I think I have most of the series on ebook, so maybe I'll slot that in as like pellet cleansers or something. So I read the 2 books from the Winter Night trilogy. Oh God, do I put that above? Oh, that's hard. So Girl in the Tower is the second book in the Winter Night trilogy. Winter of the Witch is the third one. I read these for a read along that Evie from She Was Only Evie was doing. And I love that series. God, I feel like I can't put it above Assassin's Apprentice, but part of me wants to. Girl in the Tower really expands on the character of Vasya. And then Winter of the Witch, which is right here, is even better, I think, as far as come on, why do you hate me? Tying all of the threads together and really introducing historical fiction elements of it. It was just absolutely beautifully done. I really, really admire that was Arden's debut series. Then we have another manga. I hate that this tier maker cuts off the top of this because I'm trying to remember. It's something like Girls Tour. I'm terrible with names. I'll list it in the description once I get done with this video, just so you guys know which one. Last Girls Tour, maybe? This is too cozy for me. As people who know me have noticed, cozy does not always work for me. I'd probably put it above Jin Falls in Love. It's just 2 girls traveling together in an apocalyptic wasteland, and that sounds like it wouldn't be cozy, but it's basically just them left in the world, and they're just rolling around in their tank trying to get enough food and raid old resources. It's just, if you want something really cute, and I don't know if the further books in the series have more conflict, but this one does not. So it might be more your cup of tea than mine. Oh man, Goblin Emperor is so good. Yeah. Thank you. So I do like to include manga and audiobooks just because I don't really see them as being separate. I didn't separate out anything. I have nonfiction in here and I have horror and everything else all together. As far as a reading experience goes, I feel like it's not dissimilar enough to separate them out. So that's kind of why I include them. But I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison. Super slow, character driven political fantasy. And before this year, like I said in my best of, before this year, I would have said I would not enjoy this book. I only picked it up because I had loved The Taste of Golden Iron and it got compared a lot to Goblin Emperor. But this was just beautiful. I loved the sort of toss you in world building. The main character is a cinnamon roll half goblin young guy that ends up becoming emperor in when everybody else in line for the throne dies, and sort of has to jump in and figure it out even though he has no training for it, because no one thought he would become emperor of this elven kingdom. And it's so sweet to follow him and see how he just tries to be the best he can be. It's just adorable. It is more of a formal writing style. So if the writing style doesn't jive for you, you probably won't enjoy it as much as I did, but I didn't mind that style. How many have I made it through? Hopefully I'm at least halfway, because I'm being a jabbermouth here. The Guns Above by Robin Bennis is fantastic steampunk military fantasy with a prickly main character. I loved this. When I put it above Exit Strategy, maybe not. I'll put it there. You kind of have to like military fantasy because it is super focused on that. You have the first female airship captain who is trying to prove herself and ends up having to deal with sort of an aristocrat fop on her ship who is attempting to undermine her secretly. And the banter between them is amazing. So if you like banter, check that one out for sure. But there is also at the beginning, there's a fair amount of airship terminology to wade through. So I'd recommend the audio for that one. The audiobook for that is narrated by Kate Reading, and she does a great job. So definitely would recommend that one. Half a Soul. Oh boy. Hopefully I don't upset anyone by saying this, but I enjoyed it until the end. The end was very unsatisfying for me. This is sort of fantasy romance with the Fae and someone who basically had half her soul taken by a Fae when she was a child, so she doesn't feel emotions like you're supposed to. The banter and the characters at the beginning I loved. I just didn't feel like the conflict was resolved in a way that I found satisfying. So that was not as much fun for me. So kind of mixed bag on that one. Then Harrow. I have to put Harrow second. This is the second book in the Locked Tomb series. I really enjoy Harrow the more that I read it, and I feel like you get to know characters that you met in Gideon. You get to know them a lot better. You get a lot more answers on world building. There's an interesting narrative perspective that Ware uses in that one that I really liked, but I don't have as much personal attachment to it because I loved the character of Gideon so much in the first one that I read Gideon 3 times this year. After reading for the first time last year, I should say 2021. Harrow I read twice this year and really enjoyed it. It's a personal attachment thing. Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson is one of those books that I respect more than I loved it. I'm going to put it down here. This is a haunted house story where you have people who are staying in a haunted house overnight to try and see what happens. Excuse me. And it's very creepy. It's not scary. Even as a scaredy cat type of reader doesn't read horror very often, it's not going to scare you, I don't think. But you get to see this transition of someone staying in a haunted house and how the house kind of plays with them in a way that is very interesting. And that matches up with what I've read from Shirley Jackson in the past, too. I read, I think it's We've Always Lived in the Castle, which is more disturbing than it is scary. So if you like being somewhat disturbed, but not a lot of gore and stuff like that, Shirley Jackson is an interesting author to check out. Then we have Index, A History of the, this is very dry, sort of nonfiction about the history of indexes. So I feel like it works for a very specific audience. I love history, and this is by Dennis Duncan, I believe. It's just a little too dry for me, and it has too many references to classical literature that the author clearly expects you to know, but I didn't. So it was fine. Okay. I'll just pull in the other one. So this, When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain, is the second book in the Singing Hills cycle. I liked this better than the first book, which means I got to put it up here. Not necessarily my favorite in the Singing Hills cycle, but it follows Claire Chi as they end up needing to get to a remote location. There's this sort of mammoth core that helps Chi get there, and they end up getting ambushed by tigers and have to tell stories in order to delay them from eating them. So the voices of the tigers makes for a fun story, but it's not my favorite of the series. What is my favorite of the series is Into the Riverlands. This, I don't even remember where I rated this in my top 10. I'll put it here for now. Again, by Niveau. This has a lot of martial arts influence. I love what it has to say about legends and the way you're remembered. I think it is the most thematic of the series, but not in an obnoxious way. Jackalope Wives is an anthology by T. Kingfisher. It's very good. I'd probably put it in there. Mostly based on fairy tales. Some of them are Southwest inspired. Some of them are just general fairy tales. But if you like T. Kingfisher, definitely pick up Jackalope Wives. It's really fun. And I have Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. This is the first book in the Emperor of the Wolf series. I think I gave this 4 or 5 stars when I read it. And since then have started to feel more meh on it. Probably put it maybe above Chloe Brown and above that one too, I guess. Somewhere in here. The perspective is told by the assistant of a justice, Conrad von Volt, who goes around solving crimes in this empire. The assistant's a teenager. She gets really obnoxious in parts, and that's mostly what I remember from that book, is how annoying she was. But it's an interesting magic system that kind of reminded me of The Witcher, just in terms of tone and atmosphere. Leech by Hiron Ennis is a fantastic, very slow-paced, slow-burn horror. It has a lot of elements of body horror in it. I think it works for a very specific reader because it is a very distant writing style. Not a lot of characters because of some story elements that are in there. Involves a doctor investigating a remote mansion. There's some hive mind elements that are very intriguing, but I think it only works for a very specific type of reader. You have to like the slow-paced horror. Oh boy. Legends and Lattes is one of my hot takes. I wish I liked this more. I would probably put it at the top of didn't hate it. It's just a type of cozy that doesn't really work for me. I wish I loved Legends and Lattes because I love D&D and I thought I would love something cozy. It's just too much of a focus on coffee for me. Even though the audiobook is fantastic. The narration by the author Travis Baldree is very good. So just not for me, really. Lightfall is a graphic novel. I think it's technically middle grade with a Grump and Sunshine dynamic. It's freaking adorable. Highly, highly recommend picking this up. It's just classic fantasy adventure. It deals with anxiety in a very wonderful way. I don't remember the author for it, but definitely recommend Lightfall. Sorry, Kirsten. I kind of thought that might upset you a little bit. Yeah. It's just Legends and Lattes ain't for me, but I understand why people love it. Little Thieves by Margaret Owen was a total surprise for me. I loved this. It's like part fairy tale, like Goose Girl retelling, and part heist novel. I don't love YA as much as I used to, just because I have a harder time identifying with the main characters now. But man, it was snarky, and I loved the themes in there. The main character, Vanya, is the maid who basically masquerades as the princess from the Goose Girl, and she's very prickly, but I totally came to root for her. I loved Vanya. Then we have Long Game by KJ Parker. This is difficult to understand, but if you enjoy Parker's humor, you don't really care. It's just fun. He's very cynical. It's following an exorcist who's basically made friends with a demon over years of interacting with each other. So it kind of has like some vibes of Good Omens, but like if you took that and made it as cynical as possible. So it's very confusing. Not a lot is explained, but if you like the humor, it might work. Excuse me. Then we have Lore Olympus. Man, another hot take. Here, I liked it less than Legends and Lattes. This is a graphic novel. It's very pretty. Hades and Persephone retelling. I stay away from Greek myth retellings mostly because I don't love how much sexual assault and messed up dynamics are typically in those retellings. And so that was the case here. It's more modern retelling of Hades and Persephone, and I just don't love it. I managed to group all of the memoirs of Lady Trent together. Look at me go. Except for the first one. Okay, so we'll go with the first one. So, Natural History of Dragons, the first one in the Memoirs of Lady Trent. I would actually probably put it in almost there. I really like this. You have a woman who wants to be a naturalist and study dragons scientifically in a sort of like 18th, 19th century alternate version of England. I liked her and I liked this exploration. I didn't love some of the romantic elements I had a harder time buying into, but overall, this is one of the better ones in this series, I think. The second one is The Tropic of Serpents, which really just wasn't for me. It gets heavily into sort of some political elements in the story where Lady Trent ends up adventuring in sort of like an Africa. No worries. Hopefully I have some good ones for you for book recommendations. Yeah. Agreed on Greek retellings. So Tropic of Serpents is fine. It's one of my least favorite Lady Trent books just because it does things I don't love with the political elements, and not enough dragon focus for me. The third one is Voyage of the Basilisk, which is probably my favorite of the whole series. What maybe here. Lady Trent basically goes on an ocean voyage for that one, and you get so many explorations of different types of dragons, and that I loved that. The ending is a little rushed and a little ridiculous, but overall, probably my favorite of the series. Although Labyrinth of Drakes definitely gives it a run for its money. That's the fourth book in the series, takes place in a desert atmosphere. You get some character arcs that are delightful. And you get enough dragons out of this one, I felt like, as well. And then another hot take, I guess. I was really unhappy with the direction that Within the Sanctuary of Wings took. I was really hoping it wouldn't go in the direction that it did, and it didn't ruin the series for me, but it makes it hard to pick up that last one, Turning Darkness into Light, because it continues in that direction. And like I said, in my disappointments of the year, just wasn't for me. Probably my hottest take that I'm not going to get into because I've talked about this a lot, and that's The Maid by Nita Prose. I hated this. I should have DNF'd this. Yeah, agreed on Within the Sanctuary of Wings, Kristen, for sure. Such a disappointment. But yeah, most people find The Maid very cozy. I think if you like cozy mysteries and you can hang with a naive character, you might enjoy The Maid. There's still some elements of the mystery I don't like, but yeah, that's enough of that. Should have DNF'd it, didn't, so it's on my bottom tier. Monster She Wrote. I don't remember the authors for this one, but this is spectacular literary nonfiction. Where would I put you? This is the trouble with combining nonfiction with fiction. Yeah, maybe we'll put it up here. This is an exploration of a lot of the female authors in horror and speculative fiction that tend to be ignored or glossed over. You get, each chapter is on a specific author. You get recommendations of what books to pick up by those authors. You get some comparisons of similar authors who might also work for you. It is, if you want to add to your TBR and you like speculative fiction and horror, pick this up. It's fantastic. Then we have Network Effect, which is the fifth book in the Murderbot series. This is so good. It is a much better, in fact, I would put it above that for sure. Maybe in here somewhere. Much, much better exploration of bot identity and Murderbot's relationships with the people it cares about. It ends up getting dragged in when some of its humans are kidnapped. Some of the banter that's in there is incredible. It is my favorite of the Murderbot series. And I am super excited to see where Wells goes with this because it leaves off on such an interesting point for Murderbot. So definitely recommend that one. I mean, obviously, you'd have to read the whole Murderbot series. And if you don't like Murderbot, don't go that far. But it's great. Nevermore. This is the first book. I think it's technically called The Trials of Morgan Crow by Jessica Townsend. It's a middle grade fantasy that gets compared to Harry Potter a lot as sort of like a new version of Harry Potter. It is very cute. It is very appealing because the main character spent her whole life believing that she's like cursed and her curse brings awful things to the town that she lives in. It didn't blow me away. Some people have liked it more than I did, but I thought it was very enjoyable. Nine Goblins is one of T. Kingfisher's first, I don't know if you'd call it a short story or a novella, maybe somewhere in between. It's fine. Why did I put that? Nah, I'd put that below Legends and Lattes. It's good. It's basically a group of goblins accidentally end up on the other side of a war. They get launched by a cannon or magic, I don't remember. And they end up on the wrong side and have to make their way back home. And it's like you can see where Kingfisher developed ideas from it, but it's just not a very cohesive story. So it's probably my least favorite Kingfisher story I've picked up. And that's saying something because I love Kingfisher. So for me to read something this low is hard. Then we have Nona the Ninth. That's the most recent book in the Locked Tomb series. I cannot justify putting it in all-time fave, even though I love the Locked Tomb. It explains a lot about the world building in the Locked Tomb. You find out a lot of things. There's very intriguing connections that you can make, but the character of Nona is she feels more like a plot device than a character, and I didn't love that. So I would probably put Nona here. All right, I'll put it here. Again, it's Locked Tomb. I'm gonna enjoy it, but it's just not as good to me as Gideon or Harrow. And I've only read that one once versus the multiple times I've read Gideon and Harrow, so maybe further rereads will change my mind, but I just don't love it. Ogres by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I hated 75% of this novella, and then the final 25% surprised and impressed me. There's a specific narrative trick that Tchaikovsky is playing with, and I hated the main character, but I liked what he did with it. So I think overall I'd put it in enjoyment, but I definitely struggled with Ogres. Another disappointment. I liked this more than The Maid. I would have DNF'd it if I hadn't been reading it for a readathon. I read it specifically for the Once Upon a Readathon that Hannah Blackwell did because it fit the hard mode for a prompt. This is by Roshani Chakshi. It's sort of a parody of fairy tales, but it's too on the nose for me. So I again should have DNF'd. The Ones That Got Away is a Stephen Graham Jones anthology. It's very good. Disturbing as everything by Stephen Graham Jones is. It's hard for me to put an anthology in almost there, so I don't think I can push it that far. Maybe somewhere in here. Very, very good anthology. And then I have Saints of Steel series by T. Kingfisher. This is a fantasy romance series that takes place within her World of the White Rat. And mixed quality, but really, really interesting take on paladins in a fantasy world. I think I actually like this series better for the take on paladins than I do necessarily for the romance. I think I would put Paladin's Grace is the first one. Excuse me. Probably put it above Long Game, actually. Top of Enjoyed It. Paladin's Strength is the second one. It's even better. I really like the two main characters in Paladin's Strength. And then Paladin's Hope is the least strong of the three. I would put it above Nine Goblins, but probably below Legends and Lattes. I was kind of disappointed. Actually, no, I'm going to put it here. Because the way it leaves off is so intriguing for what Kingfisher is going to do in future installments and for the World of the White Rat in general. Plot-wise, it is much stronger than character focus. Perfect Heresy is a nonfiction that I picked up because it covers the Cathar heresy, which is happened during, it happens in the Middle Ages. It is sort of influential on A Song for Our Bun by Guy Gabriel Kay, which I'll get to here in a sec. And I read it so that I'd have a better background on that. And it's a type of history that I don't love, where it gets sort of a little over the top and judgmental because it's being written by a journalist and not a historian. And there's just a different perspective on how you tell history between those two fields. So it's, if you want to know about the Cathar heresy, it's a short primer on that. So I'd recommend it on that note. Next one's Power of Habit. This is sort of self-help personal development on habit, how you make habits, how you break habits. It's very interesting. I guess I'd put it above Perfect Heresy. So I would recommend it if you're curious about that sort of thing, but it's not something I'd consider required reading. Then we have Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. Sorry, Kristen, if you're here, because I think you liked this one. This is not for me. Do I put it? Okay, I'm gonna put it up here. Actually, I think I actually liked it better than Book Eaters, so I'll put it up there. This is the first book in the Monk and Robot novella series. Yeah, sorry. And it's just too cozy for me. I really struggled. It's very thematic. I talk about it a lot in my disappointment series, so I won't go further than that. But it's not for me. It's too thematic for me. Then we have Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water, which you see almost none of on this cropped cover. This is by Zen Cho. It's a novella. I loved it. I would definitely put it in the almost there. It's sort of, you get martial arts elements. You have this former nun who ends up joining a clan of bandits and causes all kinds of trouble. The banter is brilliant. It is by far my favorite book by Zen Cho. So highly, highly recommend Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water. It does have a different writing style. Like, it's very clearly written with dialogue that is more, I think, South Asian inspired, because if you come from a Western mindset, it takes a little bit to get used to, but I think it's really, really well done. I think, in fact, I want to move this further up this list. I'd probably put this here. It's really well done. The Shadow of Death by Terry Moore is a graphic novel. It's good. Didn't blow my mind, but it's very interesting. You have the main character coming back from death after being murdered, and then trying to figure out what the heck's going on, like why she's come back and the implications. So it's, if you like sort of creepy graphic novels, check it out for sure. Raven and the Reindeer by T. Kingfisher. This is going in favorites. I love this. I love it more than Clockwork Boys. It did not make my top 10 only because I have What Moves the Dead on my top 10. I'd probably put it there. Super atmospheric retelling of The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen with a slight bit of romance in there. T. Kingfisher's standard, very relatable, anxious people trying to like find their way in the world. It is so cute. I loved it. Another hot take. Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. This is a thriller that follows two dads whose gay sons were murdered, and they didn't really support their sons very much while they were alive, so they basically go out for revenge. This just is a writing style that doesn't work for me. I would probably put it here and didn't hate it. A lot of people love this and feel very emotional about it. I found it a little predictable And it has an interesting combination of beautiful prose and extreme violence. And that combo just really was something I struggled with. But if you like thrillers, there's a lot of really interesting things that Razorblade Tears does. It's just not necessarily for me. Ooh. And then we have my least favorite Murderbot book that I really struggled with. It's probably above that. Maybe here. Rogue Protocols, the third book, third novella. It's just not a very good exploration of bot identity. This is where Wells first starts doing this, like comparing Murderbot to other types of bots and how it fits into that spectrum. And I don't care about any of the humans it introduces. The storyline is disjointed, and I feel like it's the weakest of the Murderbot stories. It's still Murderbot, so I don't hate it, but I really struggled with it. Then we have Rogue's Gallery. This is a nonfiction that has focus on the early history of the New York police and sort of the impact on the criminal gangs that were active at the time. It gets into some issues with corruption and brutality within the police force in their early days, as well as how they hunted some of these criminals. So it's written by a guy who used to be a lawyer, and it's a very nuanced take on it that I appreciated. It's not getting into modern issues, but it's very interesting. So I'd highly recommend it, as it's a good overview of both the criminals and the police in that time period. It's like 19th century. So I would definitely put it up here above Perfect Heresy for sure. Maybe somewhere in here. Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen is a reread for me that I enjoyed a lot more this time. I think Sense and Sensibility is more enjoyable if you think of it as a social commentary and less as a romance. As a romance, it's kind of weak, because the male characters they're not Darcy, right? So they're not as much fun. Some of them kind of lack backbones. So it's a lot more fun as a commentary of social status and the way that time period viewed emotion and what was proper for people. So it's way more interesting in that aspect. Servant Mage by Kate Elliott, fantastic novella. The ending's a little rushed, but overall, very good fantasy novella. Seventh Bride is another T. Kingfisher. This is a retelling. I don't think it's one of her stronger ones. The main character is less likable than most of her stories, but it's interesting. Definitely better than Nine Goblins. But again, not a fave. It feels younger than most of her other stuff. Slip of the Keyboard by Terry Pratchett is a collection of his essays and speeches. Some of it's on fantasy, some of it is on his health struggles before he died and assisted suicide. So there's some darker content in there, but it's very good. I would definitely put it in enjoyed it, but that second half is rough to read if you're a Pratchett fan. I'd put it maybe in here about Green Rider. And A Song for Our Bun, going straight to the top. I love this so much. It's very epic fantasy. It's an exploration. It's first GGK book that I ever read. I love his prose style. I love the way he makes it feel like classic fantasy, but almost historical fiction because the fantastical elements are less. I just absolutely adore that book. Spindle Splintered by Alex E. Harrow is fine. Probably put it somewhere in there. It's the first in her Fractured Fables series that retells or has elements of Sleeping Beauty. I find parts of it difficult to buy into, but it's fine. Spy Family, I read the first 2 volumes of this year and freaking loved it. I love Spy Family. It's like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, but adorable found family. This is a manga. It's you have a master spy who ends up adopting a young telepath who he doesn't know is a telepath to act as a child so he can infiltrate a boarding school. And then he has to get a wife to fill out the family and unknowingly finds an assassin who needs a marriage of convenience. It's over the top and it's silly, but it's adorable. This next one is Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. This is about using some ideals behind like high stakes poker playing to make better decisions in your life. I read it for work. It's very interesting. I wouldn't recommend it for everybody, but if you like that kind of psychology, self-help, it might work for you. And I have This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Motar and Max Gladstone. I loved the very lyrical writing style at the beginning of this. The second half got too dramatic and ridiculous for me, but I'd probably put it somewhere in here just because I liked the first half so much. You have like 2 rival agents of like a rival time travel agencies, and they end up competing at first to try and win different things as they travel through time, and then they end up falling in love. And again, the first half has a lot of banter and fun concepts in it, and then the second half is just kind of ridiculous. Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman is an adorable, cozy mystery that follows a group of senior citizens in a retirement village who they start out investigating cold cases, and then they end up investigating a murder that happens in their retirement village. And they are such a great group of nosy old people. I had a fantastic time with them. Yeah, actually, right in here is the right spot, I think, for Thursday Murder Club. If you like cozy mysteries and like nosy older people solving crimes, highly recommend. The Twisted Ones is another T. Kingfisher. This is a very interesting horror that I would put in enjoyed it, probably above Paladin's Grace. It's going to work for very specific readers because it's basically Kingfisher's take on a sort of cosmic horror genre that was popular in like the early 20th century. Sort of not Lovecraft, but similar to Lovecraft. And so she does some very interesting things with this that I think for a modern horror reader are probably too slow and too bizarre. But if you're familiar with that subgenre, is a very interesting way of handling it. Definitely high on the creep factor. We're down to the last couple. It's taken me like an hour. So slow. Unconquerable Sun by Kate Elliott is a sci-fi. It's sort of a take on Alexander the Great, but in space. The main character's son is the Alexander the Great alike, and trying to prove herself. There are moments that are pulled straight out of Alexander the Great, but you also have perspectives that are more in the like YA sci-fi range that kind of balance it out. So you're not following Sun the whole time. You're kind of following her companions as well as she tries to prove herself to her sort of very powerful mother. And I liked Servant Mage a bit better probably, but I liked the historical elements a lot. And I liked Sun as a very prickly, ambitious character. And we have In the Vanisher's Palace by Elliot de Boddard. This is a sort of dystopian Beauty and the Beast retelling where someone ends up having to live with these dragon creatures and look after their children. and is basically sort of sold into that position, and just them trying to navigate that situation. There's a sort of romantic element that gets a little awkward with power dynamics, but if you don't mind a sort of speculative retelling of Beauty and the Beast, it's an interesting one. Then we have What Moves the Dead. What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This is brilliant. It's a retelling of the fall of the House of Usher. Very creepy, elements of body horror. One of my favorites. Put it here. Definitely recommend this one if you like gothic horror. It is slow paced, so go in knowing that if gothic horror doesn't work for you, it won't work for you. But I think Kingfisher does a much better job of expanding on the original. And then the final one, we finally made it, is the first volume of Witch Hat Atelier, which is a manga, super cozy, super cute. It reminded me a lot of Studio Ghibli. The main character, Coco, is someone who has always loved magic but doesn't have the skills for magic. And then through a set of circumstances finds out that maybe she can start to study that. And sort of just goes from there. She ends up getting a mentor who takes her to a tower to train her. Very, very cute. I liked a lot of the characters in it. The art is gorgeous. I would put it slightly below Spy Family, but the only reason this wasn't on my top 10 is because Spy Family beat it out. So, all right. That is my list of all my reading in 2022. Hopefully it was at least somewhat entertaining, even if I was super long-winded. I don't think I'm going to rearrange anything in these tiers. I think I'm pretty happy with it, and I've gone on long enough. So thank you for watching. Let me know any comments down below if you've read any of these and what you think of any of my ratings. Sorry if I have hot takes that upset you, and hopefully you guys had a good time. Thanks, Kristen. You guys have a good day. Bye.